For thousands of years, human beings have looked up at the night sky and noticed that most of the stars behave themselves. They stay in their proper places, twinkling politely, like celestial pensioners waiting for a bus. But a few lights refused to stand still. They wandered erratically about the night sky, like they were trying to find the toilet in the middle of the night. The ancient Greeks called them planetes, meaning wanderers, and from those wandering lights came gods, myths, omens, and eventually several people on the internet arguing about Mercury retrograde. Today, of course, we tend to think of the planets rather differently. We've mapped them, landed things on them, crashed things into them, and in at least one case, sent a small robot to drive around collecting rocks, like an extremely expensive vacuum cleaner. But the planets aren't just balls of rock and gas floating through space. I mean, they obviously are that, very much so. NASA has photographs and everything, but they're also principles, forces, characters. So in the coming weeks, we're going to be diving into these celestial troublemakers and finding out why they've had such a lasting impact on the human imagination. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the planets. So we've spent the last 12 episodes working our way through the signs of the Zodiac, from Virgo all the way around to Leo, because starting at Aries would have been far too straightforward. But the signs are only half the story. If the Zodiac gives astrology its scenery, the planets give it a plot. They move through the signs, activate the chart, and generally cause the kind of symbolic commotion that keeps astrologers, magicians, and comment sections busy for centuries. So in this series, we're going to be looking at the planets: Saturn, Jupiter, the Sun, the Moon, etc. And yes, before anyone throws a telescope at me, I do know the Sun and the Moon are not planets in the modern astronomical sense, but in traditional astrology, they're part of the Wandering Lights, basically because astrology is older than NASA. We'll be following them in the old Chaldean order, starting with Saturn, the slowest and the furthest of the visible planets. This is the traditional order behind planetary magic, planetary hours, and the days of the week. It also lines up with the sequence on the Kabbalistic tree of life, moving from Saturn in Binah all the way down to the Moon in Yesod, which is handy because after the planets, we're heading towards Kabbalah. And I do like those rare occasions when the occult behaves as though it actually plans something. Now, people have argued for centuries about what the planets are actually doing. Some see them as physical influences, some see them as gods, symbols, archetypes, or inherited patterns in the psyche. For this series, we don't need to solve that entire mechanism. We're interested in what the planets have meant, how they've been understood, and why they still give us such a powerful language for talking about life. So each episode will follow the same basic structure. We'll look at the history of the planet, its mythology, its psychology, what it means in a birth chart, what it's actually doing in the sky, and how it appears in occult correspondence. So that's the tarot, the tree of life, and planetary magic. And don't worry, the Fool's Odyssey isn't going anywhere. Part 2 begins next time with Saturn, which is unfortunate because Saturn isn't known for suffering fools gladly. The history of the planets. This is the section where we'll be diving into the history of each planet, and that means going back to our favourite ancient star fanciers Marcus Manilius and Claudius Ptolemy. And those ancient astrologers knew that the zodiac signs were only part of the story. Manilius, writing in 1st century epic poem Astronomica, puts it like this: "Thus signs or love or hate and these bestow their differing tempers on their births below. Nor is't enough to know the signs alone, the planet's stations must be justly known." Which is ancient Roman for yes, the signs matter, but don't get cocky, you've still got homework. The zodiac gives us the 12 symbolic landscapes through which the drama unfolds, but the planets are the moving actors within that landscape. So if the zodiac is the stage, the planets are the cast. And Manilius is telling us that you can't understand the play by simply staring at the backdrop. Writing in 2nd century book Tetrabiblos, Claudius Ptolemy took the same idea and, as usual, made it sound like the terms and conditions for a celestial mortgage. He said, "When therefore a thorough knowledge of the motions of the stars and of the sun and moon shall have been acquired, there seems no obstacle to deprive him of the insight offered at once by nature and his own judgment into the effects arising out of the quality of all the various influences compounded together." Classic Ptolemy, just rolls off the tongue. But his basic point is that the astrologer needs to understand the motions of the stars, the sun and moon, the planets, and the configurations present in the sky. But even then, the position alone isn't enough. You also need to understand the nature of the heavenly bodies. Not just what they're physically made of, but the kinds of influence they were believed to possess. Heading into the occult grimoires of the Renaissance and the 19th century, we find the planets surrounded by a whole celestial management structure. Not just gods and symbols, but angels, intelligences, spirits, divine names, seals, and all the other things you need when the universe starts looking suspiciously like an administrative department. Now, there have been many different approaches to this idea over the centuries, and if we tried to compare all of them, we'd still be here next week, surrounded by diagrams and regretting our life choices. So for the sake of simplicity, we're mostly sticking with 3 layers. The planet's ruling angel, its intelligence, and its spirit. The angel is the highest celestial ruler of the planet. The intelligence is the planet's ordered and harmonious side, and the spirit is the raw, heavy, more forceful end of the planetary current. Not necessarily evil in the cartoon pitchfork sense, more like the bit of the symbol that hasn't filled out the health and safety form. For example, Mercury is often linked with the Archangel Raphael, while its planetary intelligence is Tyrael, and its spirit is I'm a little bit scared that if I manage to say that out loud, the furniture is going to start floating. But these are the traditional planetary figures we'll be working with here.
The mythology of the planets.
This is the section where we'll be diving into those myths and legends. Now, when it comes to planets and mythology, most of us immediately conjure up images of the Roman gods, because that's where they got their names from. However, thousands of years before Biggest Dickus was on the scene, the Babylonians had already catalogued the heavenly bodies and connected their own gods to them. For example, Mars was associated with Nergal, the ancient Mesopotamian god of war, death and disease. Oh yes, they had the measure of Mars long before anyone else had given him a pair of sandals and a helmet. Moving forward many centuries, we also find the planets carved into the temples of Egypt. The Dendera zodiac is an ancient bas-relief from the ceiling of the chapel dedicated to Osiris at the Hathor temple in Dendera. It's been dated to around 50 BC, and if you've watched my videos on the Zodiac, you'll know that it contains many familiar characters, like Taurus the bull and Leo the lion. It also gives us the 5 visible planets, along with solar and lunar eclipses. But of course it was the Romans and the Greeks who brought us all the juicy details. Now this is where things get slightly confusing, because the planets use Roman names, but many of the famous myths come to us from the Greeks. So throughout this series, we'll use the Roman planetary name as our anchor, so that's Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus and Mercury. But we'll also be talking about their Greek counterparts, Cronus, Zeus, Ares, Aphrodite and Hermes, because that's where many of the stories are hiding. Basically, the Romans gave the planets their name badges, but it was the Greeks who came up with the epic soap operas.
The psychology of the planets.
We're going to be sticking with Carl Jung for this section and his obsession with astrology, because Jung had a habit of turning up whenever ancient symbols, dreams, myths and gods were getting together for a beer. For Jung, mythology was a symbolic language of the psyche, and astrology was part of that same symbolic world. He wrote, "Astrology, like the collective unconscious with which psychology is concerned, consists of symbolic configurations. The planets are the gods, symbols of the powers of the unconscious." Which is a wonderfully Jungian way of saying that the old gods never really went away. They just moved indoors and started calling themselves complexes. So in this section, we'll be looking at the planets as archetypal forces. Here we're talking about Saturn as a psychological pattern. So that's limitations, discipline and consequences. The voice in your head that says, maybe don't buy that ceremonial sword on Klarna. Mars becomes anger, courage and conflict. Venus becomes attraction, pleasure and beauty. Mercury becomes language and the part of the mind that can justify absolutely anything if it's given enough coffee. This doesn't mean that we're reducing astrology to psychology or pretending that myth is just therapy wearing a toga. It means in each episode we'll be asking why these planetary images still work on us, why they still feel alive, why Saturn still feels like consequences, and Venus still smells of perfume and poor decisions. We've inherited these archetypes and they form an undeniable part of the human psyche, so it seems only polite to invite them round for a cup of tea.
The planets in the chart.
This is where we're going to be looking at what the planets actually do in an astrological chart. For anyone who doesn't know, a natal chart is basically a map of the sky at the moment and place you were born, showing where the planets were in the zodiac and how the houses were arranged from your particular bit of Earth. If you haven't got one, you can get them done for free online. I got mine from cafeastrology.com, but there are lots of websites that will give you a birth chart. In any case, the moment you put a planet into a natal chart, it becomes part of a symbolic sentence. The planet tells us which force is acting. The sign tells us how that force expresses itself, and the house tells us where in life that action is likely to show up. So for example, Mars is all about drive and conflict, but Mars in Aries is not the same as Mars in Cancer. It's the same planet, but it's in a different sign, so we get a different style of expression. One charges through the door in a blur of fire and sparks. The other one has deep feelings about the door and remembers what it said in 2013. But that's still only part of the picture, because Mars in the first house is not the same as Mars in the 10th house. The first house brings it into identity and how you meet the world. The 10th house brings it into career and reputation. So it's the same planet, but it's a different room and a different situation. So in this section we'll be asking three basic questions. What does the planet mean? What happens when it moves through different signs? And what changes when it lands in different houses? Now if you watch the Fool's Guide to Astrology, you'll know that we talked about the houses, so I'll put a link and a timestamp for that video in the description. But as a rough guide, the 12 different houses describe different areas of life. The first house is you standing at the front door, so that's yourself and your identity. The 7th house is other people and relationships. The 10th house is career and public life, and so on all the way around the chart like a celestial floor plan, designed by someone who thought ordinary personalities weren't complicated enough. So when a planet lands in a house, that area of life becomes one of the places where that planetary force tends to show up. Mars in the first house might be very visible in the way someone asserts themselves. Mars in the 10th house might come through ambition, career battles, or a deeply personal feud on LinkedIn. In any case, as this series goes on, I'm going to make some extra videos on planetary placements, so the houses should start to make more sense, because we'll see the same planet moving through different parts of the chart. Now in a real natal chart, the signs and houses work together, but we're going to keep them separate for now while we're learning, because that's a whole video to itself. So with that in mind, let's check out some examples.
First, let's see how Jupiter gets on in a couple of different signs, starting with Cancer. Jupiter is exalted here, which means it doesn't rule Cancer, but it is treated as an honoured guest. Jupiter expands whatever it touches, and Cancer is the sign of home and emotional safety. So here Jupiter's generosity comes through protection and care. It's benevolence with a pile of blankets and a casserole dish.
I have brought blessings, wisdom, and enough chicken stew to feed a small village.
Now let's move Jupiter over to Capricorn. This is Jupiter in full, because Capricorn is opposite Cancer, the sign of Jupiter's exaltation. Jupiter wants to expand, bless, forgive, and generally make everything bigger. Capricorn, however, would like to see the business plan and proof that the casserole has been checked for allergens. So here Jupiter's generosity has to become more disciplined.
I have brought blessings, wisdom, a risk assessment, and a quarterly review signed in triplicate.
Now let's see what happens to Mercury when he turns up at a couple of different houses. Now because we've moved from signs into houses, we're not asking how Mercury expresses itself, but rather where Mercury shows up in life. The first house is the house of identity, appearance, and how you meet the world. Mercury is all about communication and curiosity. So with Mercury in the first house, the mind is right there at the front door. This person may come across as quick, talkative, witty, restless, or like their internal monologue has accidentally been connected to a loudspeaker.
Hello, I'm Mercury. I've already introduced myself twice, corrected the sign on the door, and started a podcast about it.
Now let's move Mercury to the third house, so we've got the same planet in a different place. Mercury is still about communication and thought, but the third house is where we find language, messages, and the local gossip network. So here Mercury is very much in its element. Words move quickly, information travels, and a simple trip to the shop becomes a conversation with 3 people, 2 dogs, and a notice board.
I only went out for milk, but I came back with a rumour, a newsletter, and someone's Wi-Fi password.
So that's the basic idea. The planet is the force, the sign is the style, and the house is where it tends to show up. In the main planet episodes, we'll look at the planet's role in the chart, its general temperament, where it's strong or challenged, and a few examples to show how it works. Then in the extra placement videos, we'll take that same planet through all 12 signs and houses. But the important thing is that you don't have to memorize every possible placement at once. Astrology is a language, and like any language, it makes more sense when you start with the grammar. Planet, sign, and house become what, how, and where. Once you've got that, the chart stops looking like a haunted dinner plate and starts becoming like something you can actually read.
The planets in the sky.
So this is the bit where we look at the actual planets in the night sky. Now I've got to say that I wasn't all that interested in this kind of thing until I started studying astrology. So there's a rebuke for the naysayers. It was the Zodiac that got me into astrophysics. Take that, Neil deGrasse Tyson. In any case, I think it's worth checking out what's going on with the planets themselves, rather than just blaming them for what your ex did. This all started from these bright lights moving through the sky, and these visible movements matter. Saturn moves slowly, so it became time, limits and delay. Mars glows red, so naturally everyone looked at it and thought, that looks angry. Venus shines brighter than anything except the sun and moon, and somehow manages to make astronomy look flirtatious. Mercury darts around close to the sun, appearing briefly and vanishing again, like a messenger on speed. These symbols didn't come from nowhere, they came from people watching the sky very carefully for a very long time. Not that there was much else to do 4,000 years ago, but you get the idea. So in this section we'll be looking at the planets as actual physical bodies, how they move, how they shine, why some blaze like cosmic show-offs, why others creep along like they're avoiding eye contact, and what they're getting up to while we're down here blaming them for our bad decisions.
Korrespondence Corner!
It wouldn't be a Kippy's Quest series without those crazy correspondences from the Golden Dawn, so this is where we'll be digging into those bad boys. As always, we'll start with the tarot, and each of the planets is assigned a card from the major arcana. Venus, for example, is connected with the Empress, which makes perfect sense because we're dealing with beauty, fertility, sensuality and creation. Basically, if a planet could recline on a chaise longue and make grapes look symbolic, it would definitely be Venus. We'll also be looking at the planets on the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Now if you saw the Zodiac series, you'll know that each sign was placed on a path between the Sephiroth. The planets work a little differently. Instead of living on the paths, they're given a whole Sephira of their own, which feels very grand, like being upgraded from a corridor to your own office. So when we talk about Saturn, we'll also be talking about Binah. When we talk about Jupiter, we'll be talking about Hesed. And gradually, episode by episode, we'll be building the Tree of Life in the background, like a mystical flat-pack wardrobe. Except the instructions are in Hebrew. And this brings us neatly onto one of the stranger-looking correspondences, the planetary squares. At first glance, these look a bit like occult Sudoku, which is very exciting if your idea of a wild Friday night is numerology with a notepad and a pen. Each classical planet has a magic square, also called a Khmer, and the size of the square matches the planet's place on the Tree of Life. Saturn belongs to the third Sephira, Binah, so Saturn gets a 3x3 square. Jupiter belongs to the fourth Sephira, Hesed, with a 4x4 square, all the way down to the Moon at the ninth Sephira, Yesod, who gets a massive 9x9 square. Saturn gives us the simplest example. Its square uses the numbers 1 to 9, arranged in a 3x3 grid, so that every row, column and diagonal adds up to 15. The whole square adds up to 45. Mathematically, this creates a balanced pattern. Occultly, that balance becomes Saturn's numerical fingerprint, a little grid of order, structure and planetary force, looking for all the world like someone tried to summon the Lord of Time with a puzzle book. To do this, magicians used the old Hebrew numbering system, where each letter also has a numerical value. So the name of the intelligence or spirit could be turned into numbers. Those numbers could be traced across the square, and the result was a seal, a name turned into geometry. Because just writing something down normally was never going to be dramatic enough. The next set of correspondences we'll be looking at is all to do with planetary magic, and that is about working with the symbolic energy of a specific celestial force. You choose the planet whose qualities you want to connect with, and then you use the correspondences linked with that planet to help create the right atmosphere, focus and intention. So if you're focusing on relationships, you might want to work with Venus. You might choose Friday because that's the day of Venus. You might use Venusian colours, scents, music, stones or imagery. Not because the universe refuses to listen unless you've got the correct tablecloth, but because all of those things help tune the mind towards a particular quality. In the case of Venus, that would be beauty, attraction, harmony, pleasure, connection, and all that nice soppy stuff. The correspondences become a way of speaking the planet's symbolic language. And that can be as elaborate or as simple as you like. Some people perform full ceremonial rituals with planetary hours, invocations, talismans, and carefully prepared spaces. Other people might just wear a colour, light an incense stick, write an intention, or just use the planetary day as a reminder to focus on that part of life. The important thing is that these correspondences aren't just random trivia, they're tools for attention. And attention, as any magician, psychologist, advertiser, or toddler with a saucepan will tell you, is extremely powerful. So in each episode, we'll gather a small handful of these correspondences. The day of the week, the metal, the colours, the scents, the stones, and the kind of magical work traditionally connected with that celestial force. And while we're on the subject of stones, Otter Spirit have a wonderful range of gemstone jewellery that gives us another way into that same symbolic language. For example, one of the gemstones associated with Venus is malachite, which means Venus has already found her way into the sponsor segment and is now reclining there looking rather splendid in her malachite bracelet and necklace set. Don't forget you can use the code KIPPY20 for 20% off and KIPPY30 for 30% off orders over $100.
Just a quick reminder that channel memberships are now open if you fancy going a bit deeper with some extra videos. A huge thank you to everyone who's already joined. Your support helps keep the fool wandering through increasingly expensive animated nonsense.
Kippy's Quest. Kippy's Quest. Yay!
So that's the map for the series. We've got the history, the mythology, the psychology, the planet in the chart, the planet in the sky, and of course Correspondence Corner. Because no Kippy's Quest series is complete until someone has assigned a colour, a tarot card, and a suspicious smelling incense to absolutely everything. Next time we begin properly with Saturn, the slowest and furthest of the classical planets, the old edge of the visible cosmos, and the grand celestial representative of time, limits, discipline and consequences, which is a bold place to start because the fool usually responds to consequence by walking briskly in the opposite direction. But he can't avoid them for long because the fool's odyssey is returning and those planets are waiting for him. So join us next time for Saturn, the Fool's Guide. I'm going to leave you with this quote from Paracelsus, who once said, "Man is a microcosm or a little world because he is an extract from all the stars and the planets of the whole firmament, from the earth and the elements, and so he is their quintessence."
Thank you for joining us on this wander around the solar system. May your planets be well placed, your correspondences be colour coded, and may Mercury keep his hands off your Wi-Fi. Until next time.